So for those of you who missed the lesson today, and just as a little recap of what we went through, we looked at kind of three key topics which were towards the end of the specification in the global section, and it was looking at global policies, but more specifically kind of how changes to fiscal policy, monetary policy or supply side policies could solve some of the bigger problems that we've looked at, like inequality, poverty, national debt, and international competitiveness. And it was to be able to evaluate them in terms of how effective they could be. Now, one of the key phrases in the little section which it mentions is the difference in point of views between right-wing economists, or kind of free market economists, and intervention or government intervention economists on the left, kind of called the Keynesians. So kind of Hayek, Friedman, these are called monetarists, and the Keynesians are kind of on the left. The monetarists, and kind of this is a quote from Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. His main belief on that is that when the money supply increases more rapidly than output, that this is going to lead to inflation. So he sees intervention in monetary policy, and specifically the supply of money, as being the key thing that causes inflation. Keynesians think inflation is caused by other things. So quite often it's mentioned that it's kind of the factors of production, the cost of those going up, either through wages and wage demands, or through the kind of price of raw materials. And that then you would have government intervention to try and bring down those things. The next thing we looked at is kind of Footloose Industries as an example of FDI. So and what these businesses are is businesses that can move very quickly to a different country or to a different location. So what it says here is that transportation costs are not a factor. Usually because if transport costs were a factor, you'd either locate close to your raw materials or close to your customers, and so that doesn't impact on their profits. And some examples there are things like call centres. A lot of these have moved out of the UK, credit card processing centres, and kind of online companies whose presence online isn't determined by a location. Some companies where the product is very expensive, and the example I've used here is computer chips. Again, they can move because the transportation costs are a really small part of the average unit cost. The problem with Footloose Industries is that to get them into the economy in the first place, the government normally bribes them with 0% corporation tax, some kind of subsidies in terms of help them build the factory, or to import the capital, physical capital, and likely some kind of free trade application where they don't pay tariffs, or they don't get charged tariffs on the raw materials that they want to bring into the country, and then it's usually for a period. So if it's linked to development, it's highly unlikely in the short term you're going to get any benefits in terms of government revenue, and from that point of view, if the government is spending on health and education, those things won't improve. You might argue that in the short term they increase incomes, or they allow a movement from the primary to the secondary sector, and in that case you could apply it to the Harrod-Dover model in terms of your incomes, or the Lewis model in terms of that industrialization. The way you could look at this as well is looking at how you can prevent industries leaving your country. One of them can be those kind of enforced joint ventures. So where the business has to partner with a local infant industry, and then there's kind of a technology transfer or a sharing of capital, and then that allows staff to be trained as well. So the skills of the population and the capital increase. You could put some kind of regulations on them, or put some capital controls on them, so they can't leave the economy or take the profits out of the economy over time. The last thing we looked at was something called transfer pricing, and what this is a little bit like is money laundering, but what it allows a business to do is to take the profits that they would have generated in a country and move them and hide them from corporation tax. So the example here, OECD countries, these are just the rich countries in the world. On average, corporation tax is about 30%, some countries higher, some countries lower. But then what happens is the profits are shifted, and the costs come back. So costs from other parts of the business, so there's part of the business in the OECD country, there's a part of the business in Thailand, and then there's another offshore subsidiary that doesn't produce anything, but it's created as an entity. So the profits are created over here, and then they are moved to Thailand, where the corporation tax is 20%, and some of the expenses from Thailand are moved to this country. Then you go one step further, and then you move the profits from Thailand to the offshore or the other country, and then you go to 0% corporation tax, and you create some new costs and you bring these back as well. So what kind of happens is Thailand's the middle ground where that kind of gets cleaned and then moved on. Just to kind of highlight this in examples, so the first one, Starbucks, they avoid tax in the UK through a few different crafty ways. One of them is that the government charges them, the company has operations in the UK, and then they have operations in the Netherlands, and then they also have operations in Switzerland. They buy the coffee from themselves. So Starbucks UK buy the coffee from Holland at probably higher than market prices, so higher than the price that Starbucks have actually charged. So they create a profit margin within their own company, and that reduces the profits of the UK. So one part of it is kind of creating extra costs. Also, they charge them for advertising, but not advertising that actually happens, just the use of the Starbucks brand. So there's kind of an extra cost there. So the coffee beans are costing them more, and there's some made up advertising costs that don't exist. So both of those are going to reduce the profit within the UK. And lastly, how they get rid of the last bits of profit is that the parent company takes out a loan at, let's say, 0.5% interest. Then they lend that money to the UK and they charge them 5% interest. So an artificial interest rate within your company to again erode the profit. And then once all that money's moved to Holland, they do a little bit of cleaning of it there, but then they move it even further into Switzerland and pay even less corporation tax there. The example down the bottom here is McDonald's have done a very similar thing, and they've paid no tax in America or the EU. So you've got the EU restaurants here making monies, but they are paying royalties, same as Starbucks do, kind of the brand royalties, to the Luxembourg head office. Then they clean a bit of the taxes in Luxembourg, but they pay no tax on that and they do some administration. Then the Luxembourg office pay the royalties into Switzerland, and again there's a bit of cleaning done with the tax administration. They pay the corporation tax there, again very low rate of corporation tax, and then most of the money then comes back to the head office in America, where again there's no tax paid. So the profits that's actually being made in Europe through transfer pricing get wiped out, but it finds its way back to America, and those manage to go back to the shareholders. But again, no corporation tax paid in America. So in terms of a country, and linked back to those footloose industries, and FDI in general, it's whether or not domestic or international businesses are the best for your economy. And as international businesses are doing this dodgy stuff of avoiding paying their taxes, and some British companies do it as well, you could argue that it would be better to have domestic businesses and domestic businesses that aren't operating in other countries. However, the EU is very good at catching these companies and finding them, so you could say that it's a scope we step in terms of you need all countries, or at least a significant number of countries in an area, to have legislation to find companies to prevent them from doing that.